entrepreneurship, and wealth creation. For many, the fundamental problems of poverty and unemployment persist, which existed earlier too, but have been accentuated by globalization. Economic inequalities among rich and poor people in the world have risen at an exponential pace to reach awesome levels. The World Inequality Report estimates that in 2021, world income distribution was most unequal. The share of the top 10% was 52%, of which that of the top 1% was almost 20%, while that of the bottom 50% was a mere 8%. The distribution of wealth was far more unequal. The share of the richest 10% was 76% of global wealth, of which that of the top 1% was as much as 38%, while the poorest 50% had a minuscule share at 2% of global wealth. Inequality in income and wealth distribution between people within countries has reached similar levels almost everywhere. Now, among countries, the benefits of prosperity created by globalization have accrued essentially to a small number of industrialized countries and a few emerging economies in the developing world. Development has been most uneven across geographical space. In the industrialized countries, the benefits have been captured by the United States and some countries in Western Europe, while Southern Europe and the transition economies of Eastern Europe have fared worse and fallen behind. In developing countries, the benefits of globalization have been captured by a few emerging economies in Asia. In alphabetical order, China, India, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam, that were latecomers to industrialization, but created the initial conditions combined with institutions and policies to benefit from economic openness. Even among this small group in Asia, some have done much better than others. Suman talked about Thailand and India. While China has been the star performer, leaving everyone way behind. Latin America stayed roughly where it was in 1980, although Brazil, Chile, and Mexico have derived some benefits, but much of Africa experienced regress. The increased divergences within the developing world are also striking, as the least developed countries, as many as 48, have steadily fallen behind in every sphere. Now, the smooth sail of globalization in our times has been disrupted by mounting economic problems and political challenges. There are two problems in the economic sphere that I would highlight. First, the prosperity created in this era of globalization has been captured by the few, excluding the many. Theory and history both suggest that income distributions change slowly over time. Yet, income inequality has increased at an alarming pace during the past quarter century. Consequently, the poor and the marginalized everywhere are the most vulnerable. It is no surprise that those excluded are voicing their discontents with globalization. Second, the global economic crisis in 2008, attributable to financial liberalization, and the Great Recession that followed in its aftermath, were the first setback to globalization in its present era. In response, most governments in industrialized countries and emerging economies responded with an attempt at coordination, adopted counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies. This preempted for a short time protectionist responses and beggar-than-ever policies. But it was not long before orthodox policies returned to focus on balancing budgets and managing inflation, even if this solution turned out to be worse than the problem, as the slowdown in economic growth and employment creation accentuated the difficulties of those excluded. Such policy responses are, in fact, shaped by globalization, as governments are sensitive to perceptions in international financial markets and worry about credit rating agencies. Both sets of economic problems have social and political consequences within countries. There are two challenges in the realm of politics that should be recognized. First, economies might have become global, but politics remains national. there is a political backlash in the form of resurgent nationalisms riding on populist or chauvinist sentiments. In recent years, election outcomes in several industrialized countries and some emerging economies highlight the political consequences of globalization. In industrialized countries, national populist political parties of far-right xenophobic populist leaders exploit fears about openness in immigration and trade as a threat to jobs. In developing countries, nationalist populist political leaders challenge or oust incumbent governments, exploiting religious beliefs or ethnic divides while pointing to rampant corruption. It would seem that such political parties outside the mainstream are now becoming the mainstream as they capture political space created by economic and social discontents associated with globalization. More than 70 countries, which account for one-half of world population, held elections in 2024. In a large proportion of these countries, nationalist populist political leaders, often on the far right, captured political power, ousting not only incumbent governments, but also mainstream political parties. And many of them are in coalition, even if not leading partners, or are waiting in the wings to be elected. Second, the changing international context is a big political challenge. Globalization has always required a hegemon to set the rules of the game and ensure conformity by the players, while providing a national currency that is the equivalent of international money. This role has been performed by the United States in the present era. However, the economic resurgence of Asia, particularly China, juxtaposed with the global economic crisis in its aftermath, both attributable partly to globalization, have eroded its economic dominance and political hegemony. And the United States, almost in withdrawal syndrome, seems to be relinquishing its political leadership in the world. But there is no other country yet, in my view, that could replace the United States as a hegemon. Yet, it would seem that the US, now led by President Donald Trump, is no longer interested in preserving the world order that established in the late 1940s. Indeed, as I argue in some other work I am doing, he's on a destruction path. Now, thus, an uncertain future for globalization looms large on the horizon. The problems, Trump is the latest development, but the problems were exacerbated by the coronavirus pandemic, which persisted for 2 years, stifling international trade, investment, and financial flows that are the lifeblood of globalization. But more was to come. The Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war on both sides of the Gaza Strip might have been localized, but the continuing conflict has created global ripples, now extending to the Oval Office. It has also accentuated uncertainty and risk in the economic and political spheres, making markets nervous. Global supply chains are stockpiling inventories, while large international firms are contemplating relocating or dispensing with offshore production as an insurance against shortages or disruption, reinventing established business models. Governments worried about global risks are in search of national economic security or strategic economy to reduce dependence on the outside world. Indeed, this, I think, is the most difficult conjuncture for the world economy in more than a century. Financial crises have dented faith in markets. Economies are going through difficult times, if not crises, with growth slowdowns, double-digit inflation, and persistent unemployment. Heavily indebted poor countries are at the edge of the precipice. International institutions are creaking at the seams. The IMF and the World Bank have failed to reinvent themselves in changed times. The WTO seems to be at a dead end, and Mr. Trump is about to bury it. The United Nations system, which has lost its way, is neither credible nor effective, even if the world sorely needs such an institution. It is clear that this era of globalization is at risk. You might ask, is it an ebb? Is it a pause? Or is it the end? I'll give you my answer in the end. In addressing this question, I believe there is much we can learn from history, which suggests that earlier epochs of globalization during the past millennium came to an end because of their own consequences embedded in the process. Let me then turn to the long-term historical perspective. There were three profound historical events during the second millennium which were conducive for globalization in a substantive sense and connected different regions and peoples of the world. The first was what I call Pax Mongolica in the early 13th century. The second was the voyages of discovery, circa 1500. The third was the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the late 18th century. Pax Mongolica. The nomads of Central Asia, the Mongol tribes, were forged into an effective union by the genius of Temujin, who was proclaimed as Genghis Khan, universal ruler in 1206. Under his leadership, until his death in 1227, followed by his descendants in the same tradition, the entire Eurasian landmass from China in the east to Iraq, Iran, and Russia in the west, extending to Hungary and the Adriatic Sea by 1240, were conquered to establish Pax Mongolica. Globalization has always required an infrastructure of law, order, and security provided by political hegemony. Mongols were the hegemons in this era who unified the Eurasian landmass under their political control and encouraged trade flows between all regions across the vast geographical space. In fact, it was only the Mongol Empire that welded the segments and loops on the Silk Road into a single route. Until then, it was no more than links in a chain. Once established, every region, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Islamic world and Europe, participated in international trade. The geographical unification drove economic interaction, even if it was not hegemonic, but there was a flip side. Bacteria, germs, and viruses that were local to particular regions also moved across long distances carried by people and animals. Plague germs were carried by Mongol troops with their horses from Central Asia to the Black Sea in 1347. These were transmitted by ships to ports around the Mediterranean and across Europe. It is estimated that the plague, the Black Death, killed more than 25 million people out of a total population of 80 million in Europe in just 3 years, from 1348 to 1351. This was among the most devastating catastrophes in human history. The global spread of disease was a corollary of economic integration brought about by the Mongol Empire. It led to the formation of a common market, not only for goods, but also for microbes and germs. The mid-14th century witnessed the disintegration of Pax Mongolica when the internal conflict among Mongol states coincided with the loss of Persia and China. In the absence of imperial rule, trade routes were no longer safe, secure, or open. The Silk Route, too, was closed down by the Ottoman Empire in the early 15th century. It would seem that in this epoch, globalization sowed the seeds of its own destruction. B. Voyages of discovery in the late 15th century, led by the Iberian states, were perhaps the next major turning point. The Europeans were trying to bypass the Arabs who had monopolized Asian maritime trade. Hence, there was need to find a direct sea route to India, which would also lead further east. The first milestone was attained in 1488 when Bartholomew Diaz found the southern tip of Africa that he aptly named the Cape of Good Hope. Christopher Columbus, a native of Genoa, peddled his idea of sailing across the Atlantic to many European states, which was ultimately supported by the monarchs of Spain in Aragon and Castile. Columbus sailed from Cadiz in 1492 with just 90 men in 3 ships to his momentous discovery, even though it is now established that he rarely knew where he was, let alone where he was going. So when he arrived in the United States, he thought he had arrived in India. Vasco da Gama left Lisbon in 1497 with 2 ships and a support vessel to reach Calicut on the Malabar coast of India in May 1498. Everyone here knows that. The voyages of Columbus to the Caribbean were followed by several Spanish expeditions. The exploratory flotilla led by Hernan Cortes of 11 ships, 100 sailors, and 500 soldiers touched the Mexican coast in Yucatan and landed in Veracruz in April 1519. Just 2 years later, the mighty Aztec Empire was destroyed, not by the 500 soldiers Cortes brought, but the microbes and germs that they carried from Europe. These voyages were brought to completion by Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe in 1521. Now, this sequence of discoveries led to the first phase of European colonial expansion in the early 16th century. It began with Spain and Portugal. The slave trade from Africa, the search for silver in the New World, and the colonization of the Americas were all part of this process, which unleashed a somewhat different dynamic in the formation of the world economy. It was the age of mercantilism in Europe. The acquisition of colonies was associated with the mercantile expansion of trade. Old world trade and new world silver turned out to be powerful complements in stimulating trade flows, as Europe paid for its imports of textiles, spices, porcelains, and silk from Asia, largely China and India, by exports of silver obtained from the Americas. The New World provided Europe with a source of primary commodities such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and timber, apart from the windfall ecological gains through access to indigenous plants in North America, like maize and potatoes, just as these colonies provided export markets for manufactured goods from Europe. The slaves from Africa provided the labor for plantations, mines, and agriculture, while the migrants from Europe provided entrepreneurs in the New World. At the same time, profits from the slave trade generated resources, the first form, as it were, of primitive accumulation. This period from 1500 to 1780 was clearly the second wave of globalization during the second millennium, in which Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa were all part of the process. The growing network of world trade laid the foundations for a specialization in production between continents, the benefits of which accrued in large part then to Europe. It's no surprise that there was a struggle for hegemony in the world economy. In the late 16th century, Portugal and Spain were displaced by Holland, a merchant oligarchy, as the Dutch rose to primacy in world trade. Their dominance continued in the 18th century before it was lost to the British. In this world of guns and sails, power provided for plenty. This power was obviously sustained by economy and technology. Geopolitics shaped possibilities. Economic primacy was in effect about state power and naval power, which provided protection for economic interests in distant lands and merchant ships in different waters. Such competition for power unleashed political rivalries in Europe. The period after 1780 experienced worldwide military conflict. It culminated in the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815. Trade was severely disrupted, but that was not all. Independence for the United States in 1776, and for most countries in Latin America beginning around 1810, deprived the European powers of most of their colonies in the New World. Globalization, which had evolved over 3 centuries in the age of mercantilism, came to an end once again, essentially because of the political challenges and conflicts it created. C, Industrial Revolution. This was really stage setting as a developer. Now, it is ironical that this disruption that I mentioned just now coincided in time with the beginnings of the third wave of globalization during the second millennium that was to surface a century later. It had far-reaching implications not only for Europe but for Asia, also for Asia and the world economy. Its beginnings, the steam engine, cheap iron, the spinning jenny with the cotton mill, turned out to be transformative. The cotton mill pioneered mechanization of industrial production. The steam engine produced energy through technology by using water and burning coal. The cheap iron ore came from coal that made it possible to substitute coke for charcoal in smelting. Taken together, these developments helped create an engineering industry that could produce machinery to unleash large productivity increases. More was to come later, in the mid-19th century, from the same beginnings. The idea of railways began like much earlier by hauling coal in mines and from mines to rivers. It was the iron sails and steam locomotives that made it into a means of surface transport on land. When roads did not exist or were not suitable for the purpose, the substitution of steam for sail and iron for wooden hulls in ships led to a revolution in shipping. Both led to enormous reduction in the time needed, as also the cost incurred in traversing geographical distances. The revolutionary changes in methods of manufacturing, which were developed in Britain in the late 18th century and spread to countries in Western Europe through the early 19th century, led to rapid industrialization in Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, France, and Germany, as well as profound changes in the economic life of Europe. And that brings me to the third part, before I conclude, globalization in the age of empire. The 19th century witnessed the evolution of an international economic order that led to a profound change in the balance of economic and political power in the world. It was attributable to three developments. The first was the Industrial Revolution in Britain. The second was the emergence of a newer and different form of colonialism in the early 19th century, beginning in Asia and spreading to Africa, which culminated in the advent of British and European imperialism that gathered momentum through the century. The third was the revolution in transport and communications in the mid-19th century, manifesting the railway, the steamship, the telegraph, which dismantled geographical barriers of distance and time to shrink the world. These three developments, which overlapped, transformed the world economy by creating patterns of specialization in production associated with the division of labor between nations through trade, reinforced by politics of imperialism. These three developments provided the foundations for the next wave of globalization, which began around 1870 and came to an end in 1914. This epoch of less than half a century coincided with what Eric Hobsbawm called the age of empire. It was the age of laissez-faire. The movement of goods, capital, and labor across national boundaries was almost unhindered. Government intervention in economic activity was minimal. There were, of course, differences among countries. Now, during this era, growth in exports and imports was much faster than growth in national income for most countries, so that the share of world trade in world output rose steadily. Now, it is believed by Western scholars that rapid expansion in world trade was attributable to trade liberalization. It was, in part, but only in part. Britain and Netherlands practiced free trade, for they had industrialized, but most countries in Europe and the United States practiced protection, with tariff levels in the range of 20 to 50%. Free trade was, however, imposed on the rest of the world. Imperialism prized open markets in Asia, Latin America, and Africa through gunboat diplomacy or colonial dominance. Reality did not mirror the myth of free trade. Now, there was a similar expansion, and I won't go into the detail, in international investment, just as there was significant expansion in international financial markets. That even in 1913, Moody's rated government bonds for 50 countries. Now, this epoch of globalization, reinforced by the politics of imperialism, created huge asymmetries and inequalities in the world economy, which was divided into countries mostly with temperate climates and industrialized countries mostly that industrialized, and countries mostly with tropical climates that did not industrialize. The geographical divides turned into economic divides. The industrialized countries prospered, but for countries in Asia, Africa, the same integration into the world economy led to underdevelopment. The rise of the West was concentrated in Western Europe and North America. The decline and fall of the rest was concentrated in Asia, much of it attributable to China and India. The process was associated with a growing divergence in levels of income. Between 1870 and 1913, as a percentage of GDP per capita in Western Europe and North America, GDP per capita in Asia, as also Africa, dropped from 1/4 to 1/6, and it continued to plummet thereafter until 1950. Okay? Now, between 1860 and 1920, the share of Asia, essentially, in world manufacturing production attributable to China and India collapsed from 40% in 1860 to just 7% in 1913, while that of Europe, North America, and Japan rose from 60% to 93% in just that period. Now, the much greater competitiveness of industry in Britain and Europe attributable to scale economies sharply reduced prices of manufactured goods, which led to the demise of traditional industries in Asia, China, and India. It reduced their skill levels and technological capabilities over time. This process was reinforced, as I said, by politics of pluralism that imposed free trade and the economics of the transport revolution that dismantled the natural protection provided by geography, implicit and time and distance, to hasten the process of deindustrialization in Asia with a devastating impact on China and India. Now, much of the gains from international trade in this era accrued to the imperial countries which exported capital and imported commodities. There were a few countries, like the United States and Canada, new lands with temperate climates and white settlers that also derived some benefits. In these countries, the preconditions for industrialization were already being created, so that foreign direct investment in manufacturing stimulated by rising tariff barriers, combined with technological and managerial flows, strengthened industrialization and development. But this did not happen everywhere. Development was uneven even in the West. Most of Southern and Eastern Europe lagged behind. This meant a divergence rather than a convergence of incomes. At the same time, inequality rose in resource-rich, labor-scarce, industrialized countries of the New World. This era came to an end with World War I. Now, the growing inequalities within and between countries, particularly in the industrial world, were a significant factor underlying the retreat from globalization and the outbreak of World War I. The economic consequences of the peace in 1918 had political consequences. The Great Depression accentuated these trends and induced autarky. World War II followed. International economic transactions were progressively constrained by barriers and regulations that were erected during this period of economic and political conflict. In effect, the world economy experienced deglobalization for more than 3 decades. But the return of economic openness took another 3 decades. In industrialized countries, particularly Western Europe, there was a period of reconstruction after the war. This coincided with the politics of social democracy and the idea of the welfare state. Economic openness in trade and investment remained restricted for some time. In developing countries, in the beginning of the post-colonial era, there were concerns about unregulated markets and open economies, which were perceived as the causes of underdevelopment in the past. There was a consensus that developing countries must industrialize, in which state intervention and calibrated openness were an integral part of development strategies. Now, such thinking began to change in the mid-late 70s. This process was reinforced by the rise of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in politics, which led to a profound technological or ideological transformation in the West. It was the beginning of the era of globalization in our times. Now, let me conclude. The moral of my story is simple. There is much that we can learn from history, for there is the past in our present. Indeed, the past might also help us to explore how the future might unfold. Of course, history does not repeat itself, but as Mark Twain once said, history often rhymes. Now, during the second millennium, there were waves of globalization and deglobalization, which straddled continents and geographies, driven by trade and flag, war and peace, technology and politics. For people who lived in those times, at every juncture, the process seemed unstoppable. In fact, but history suggests that globalization has always been a fragile process. In fact, it has come to an abrupt or unexpected end many times in the past. And Donald Trump might be such a catalyst. The process has also been reversible, as globalization has often been followed by deglobalization. The underlying reasons have been embedded in the consequences of the process of globalization, ranging from the spread of disease or pandemics to economic strains and political conflicts between winners and losers, whether countries or people. Of course, the backlash has taken different forms at different times. Thus, globalization has never been the end of either history or geography. At this juncture, just over 4 decades since it began life, globalization in our times is confronted with multiple economic problems and political challenges. There was a distinct slowdown in growth, as I said, during the 2010s. Economic recovery after the global pandemic was slow. In many countries, national income in 2022 just about returned to its 2019 levels. Economic inequalities within and between countries, as well as between rich and poor people in the world, increased at an alarming rate in the past quarter century. The post-pandemic recovery has been K-shaped, so that economic inequalities have continued to rise. These mounting inequalities are not only sources of potential conflict, but in my view are also ethically unacceptable and politically unsustainable. Wars between countries continue to surface. There are conflicts driven by ethnic, racial, or religious divides within countries across continents in the world. There is also political backlash, as I said, resurgent nationalism, driven or reinforced by popular discontents with globalization, which are progressively more influential across countries. The election of Trump as President of the United States is actually validating that idea. Now, there are discernible economic strains and potential political conflict between winners and losers, whether countries or people. And the world, as I see it, is in a state of flux. It really resembles the world of the 1920s and 1930s. Now, let me bring this to conclusion faster than I had intended. Now, wars between countries and armed conflict within countries, which are widespread in our world, could both have global implications. There is also a pronounced shift in the balance of economic power from the West to Asia and from the United States to China, which now seeks superpower status, while Russia is waiting for its turn at the high table. Collective action is the only way to address these challenges, but history suggests that established dominant powers are reluctant to cede economic and political space to latecomers, while collective action is easier said than done. In conclusion, I would venture to suggest that globalization in our times is nearing its end. The economic and social discontents among people created by unequal outcomes associated with our era of markets and globalization have led to a massive political backlash, with resurgent nationalism mirrored in election outcomes across the world. Donald Trump only recently assumed office as President of the United States, a country that had championed globalization not so long ago, but has now clearly started on the road to deglobalization. The retreat from globalization, discernible for some time, has now gathered momentum, and with Trump, even more speed. In my view, its end is not a matter of if, but when. Thank you.
I will take a couple of minutes to comment on Deepak's presentation and his work. I think he's scholarly, he's more journalistic and so on. I'm not being unkind to here, but I would also like to point out in a very recent book on urbanization. The title of the book is India's Blind Spot. And the other is Devasis Dutt. He is not a very well-known academician, but he worked very hard on this book. And there he refers to his advice he received from parents. I think I must say that I keep in touch with what you are doing. And so, because I have nothing else to do, I think I keep reading relevant things which interest me. Many things which are very important, I don't think. But I would like to pay my compliments to Debnath for today's lecture. Only I would like to, in this particular presentation, I don't have a extra bit, but you have not referred to Srijan's book on provision in this context.
But it's there in the reference.
Yeah, but yeah. Another is, I think, we work with Vice-Chancellor on globalization. At some stage, we work with Vice-Chancellor also.
Liberalization.
Yeah. So, I'm only trying to ask you all to do little more work. But I pay my very rich compliments to Deepak for his excellent work. And of course, I must also say, this may be a little out of, but he has been a great scholar. He works very hard on data issues, makes appropriate use of data. That is his strength. I told him when I reviewed his book on ancient intelligence in the Indian Econometric Review at his request. It took me, of course, a few months to review the book, but it is a very well-written book. It also makes use of the kind of material provided by Debnath and scholars. I don't want to take more of your time, only I would like to request Debnath to give a copy of your paper, latest this presentation at your 5 minutes. I once again compliment you. Thank you very much. Also, I'd like to thank Debnath for giving me the opportunity to attend this session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As a gesture of our gratitude, I request our esteemed chair, Dr. Krishna, sir, to present our token of appreciation to Dr. Deepak Nayyar, sir. The token of appreciation. On behalf of the organizing committee, I extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Krishna, sir. Your guidance as chair has enriched the session. Dr. Nayyar, your insightful lecture has been a fitting tribute of my Chakravarty ji's legacy. Dr. Mandal, your leadership at times continues to inspire us all. And a warm thanks to our audience for being here. Thank you, everyone.